What passes for common sense today are a lot of these slogans that you hear at places like graduation ceremonies or movies, books, television shows. Follow your heart, chase your dreams. You can do anything you want. You can be whoever you want to be. Be true to yourself. Above all, be true to yourself. You be you. But what if that way of life, what if those slogans are actually leading us to something other than true fulfillment? What if they're actually leading us down a path in which we're unable to find our truest selves, the people that we were created and designed to be? In my book, Rethink Yourself, I am bringing the ancient wisdom of the Bible to bear on a number of contemporary slogans and what passes for common sense wisdom in our day in order to challenge it, in order to probe it a little bit, and in order to help you, as the reader, rethink some of the assumptions that you've made that you thought would lead to happiness, but actually have not. Hi, welcome everyone. I am Trevin Wax. I'm the Senior Vice President for Theology and Communications at Lifeway Christian Resources. We're really excited to be here with all of you. Very thankful for a lot of the questions that you've sent, and we're looking forward to discussing the nature of apologetics in this new generation that's coming up. I have with me Josh Chatraw. He's Executive Director of the Center for Public Christianity and a theologian in residence at Holy Trinity Anglican Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. He's the author of some great books, including co-author of Apologetics at the Cross and The History of Apologetics, and Telling a Better Story, which we're going to be talking about today. So, Josh, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's exciting to be able to do this with you, Trevin. Just to give everybody a little background to me and Trevin's relationship. Followed Trevin's work and his writing, and then several years ago, when I was at Liberty University, we were able to host Trevin for an event, and I think he's come. I think they had him back after I left. He was so well received, and we were really kind of kindred souls as we talked about culture and how to interact with young people and doubts and challenges to the Christian faith. And so about several months ago when Trevin reached out to me and said, hey, I've heard about your new book. I've got a new one coming too. And I think there's a lot of synergy between the two, really, with Telling a Better Story is giving a kind of a model for how to engage in conversations. And then with Trevin's book really being a kind of an example in one area of how to do this, especially with this Gen Z kind of age range that we're talking about today. So we kind of put our heads together and said, hey, let's host this event where we interact with folks on the front lines and see if we can help them think about this some more. So I'm excited to be with you guys today.
Yeah, there definitely is a lot of overlap between Josh and my books. I look at Josh's book as like a manual, giving a method of, hey, this is how to think through apologetics and how to engage in conversations. And I'm hoping with mine that I provided something of a model of one example of how this could be done. And something that would be useful as a tool if you wanted to give the book out to students or to people who are interested in the Christian faith that don't have a background in the Bible or whatnot. But there's a lot of overlap, a lot of synergy. I would say just at the outset, the title of this event, Gen Z Apologetics in a UBU World, neither Josh nor I would consider ourselves like experts on Gen Z. I know we both read about this up and coming generation. I've got a junior in high school as a son, and my daughter's a middle schooler. I've got Gen Z in my family, I guess. We have had some interaction and some experience over the years with college students. But I think where we both fit as far as when we talk about Gen Z, when we talk about apologetics, is both of us are more like weather forecasters, helping you understand the environment that you're doing ministry in. And so a lot of the questions that we did choose from the hundreds that came in are questions that are more related to what are the atmospheric conditions so that as you are doing ministry, you understand the culture and the environment and some of the obstacles and challenges that you're up against, but also some of the opportunities that we have in this environment. So that's our goal here as we talk through these things.
Yeah, and I think just, full disclosure, your vocational context matters. And so for me, I'm in this kind of cross section between the academy and trying to stay up with what's going on there and what's going on culturally, sociologically, as well as theologically. But also, I'm at a cross section because I'm in the church. I'm a resident theologian, and I work with folks in their 20s and 30s on weekly, and lead a fellowship program for those age ranges. So I'm at this kind of unique spot where I'm reading a lot of, as Trevin is, the kind of what goes into kind of the social imaginary, how people spontaneously think about the world without thinking about it, and how that gives us both challenges and opportunities. And when it's a lot of what you'll hear in the next bit is places where we see challenges and opportunities. So a lot of the questions that you guys have sent are around, especially the challenges part. But I think there's some real opportunities, and we'll go into that in the next in our time together.
That's right. So let me just kind of show you how this is going to move forward and what the next hour and a half is going to look like. First, Josh is going to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes about just the gist of telling a better story, what the application of that apologetic method in Gen Z ministry. I'm going to then talk for just a few minutes about Rethink Yourself and how that book fits into sort of what we're talking about here. And then we're just going to get into the questions. I mean, I think I printed out, there's like 9 pages of questions here that we've gone through. We did try to take the questions that have been sent in multiple times or asked in different ways and lift those to the top. So there were several questions that were asked, basically the same question asked in different ways from different people. We did lift those to the top, and we are going to be discussing those. But again, hundreds of questions came in. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, obviously. So if you've got further questions, we'd love to be able to communicate or to talk with you after the event. We did decide to pre-record this just in case we had any Zoom glitches. So we're recording this a little earlier than the event, but we are going to be involved and engaged in the chat while the event is taking place so that we can still be engaging with you as you watch, and we're glad that you're joining us. So Josh, go ahead and kick us off with a little bit of just some overview of what you're doing in telling a better story and how it applies for apologetics today.
Yeah. I want to start off by just talking about the genesis of the book and kind of my own story, my own experience, which led to the book and the need for it. Teaching kind of two fronts again, this kind of story of the last several years is both teaching in an academic setting, teaching 19, 20-year-olds at Liberty who most of them are coming from fairly conservative homes and yet having some real doubts, having some real struggles. And because of my post and my position, they would come to me and want to talk to me about those. And at the same time, teaching apologetics and being involved in my local church and being involved in my community, what I saw that there was a real disconnect between how kind of the standard practices of apologetics were being taught, and then how to really help these students that were struggling, and also how to engage skeptics and unbelievers with apologetics. And so one of the things that I picked up on pretty quickly that was missing was there was a failure to understand, or at least to teach people, how conversations actually work. And one of the things about Gen Z is they want to have a conversation, not a monologue. They don't want to be run over. And so this kind of model that is like a dump truck of information, or imagining everyone's interested in they want to talk about the failures of Kant or or something like that in a conversation, or they're geared up for the cosmological argument, and you're just teed up ready to give it to them, is not actually how things happen on the ground. That's just not where people are. And so how do we actually engage, not to win kind of points in an imaginary debate in our head, but to actually persuade? How do we appeal to people who aren't already convinced? In other words, how do we make apologetics, evangelism, not mere kind of campaign signs? If you think about a campaign signs, I've never heard anyone say, who I voted for the president was because I saw a campaign sign. Those are more about rallying the base. And I fear sometimes these conversations have become about rallying the base, but not the real kind of doubts that our students are actually facing and the skeptics themselves. So how do we actually get into conversations that are going to open doors for the gospel? Because as I talk to people who are in ministry, that's what it's about. And I think they're right. And to the extent that they've rejected certain forms of apologetics that don't get there, I'm very sympathetic to them. On the other hand, that's not what apologetics has to be. It's certainly not what it is, I think, in its ideal form. And so to really answer the question, to really get at how to do this and try to give people a model, an approach, is really why I wrote Telling a Better Story. And there's three ancient sources. I would say that there's plenty of modern sources I could talk about that's gone into the book, but three ancient sources, and that's the Bible, that's Augustine, and that's Pascal, Blaise Pascal. And I won't go into detail right now of how they, both in the Bible, Augustine and Pascal, inform the book, but I just mentioned those three things to say, even though I've developed a model and approach, I'm not just making this up. This has ancient roots in the Bible itself, as well as some of our leading theologians in the history of the church. But the approach is this. It's called Inside Out. And it starts first knowing the gospel, living and breathing the gospel. But then because we understand the gospel and we are sent people into the world to understand the world, like Paul did in Acts 17, that we have to first start inside of where they're at, the person we're talking to, and listen and relearn this skill of listening. And as we're listening, having our ears attuned to things that we can, yes, affirm, not just critique, but affirm, and also things that we will need to challenge. And while we're listening, looking for some underlying aspirations that this person's talking about, what I call key features of personhood. Another way to put this is, what does it actually mean to be human? Things like, seeking beauty and goodness and having some kind of moral code of love, of seeking love, of wanting to be loved and wanting to love others, and looking for these things that we can affirm, but then also seeing how those things on secular storylines, on dominant storylines, don't actually find their fulfillment apart from God and the gospel. And so learning how to interact with people on these basic human levels that their story about the world is trying to answer, but is ultimately failing, and we know isn't going to end well. Idolatry never ends well. And ultimately seeing apologetic as again, Augustine, who sees, to reference Augustine, he sees the church as a hospital for sinners. So how do we pick up on that to point to the gospel and the hope in Christ? And so working inside of their own narratives, their own stories, to pick up aspirations and things we need to challenge, and then going outside to the gospel story and showing how the Christian story is actually the story that they need to make good on these deeper aspirations that they have, while challenging their idolatry, i.e. challenging their sin, absolutely, but doing it in a way that says, hey, this is what it means to be human. This is what it means to find salvation. So that's the approach, and I'm sure we'll get into some more of the kind of details of that in the Q&A.
Yeah, that's well said, Josh. I really enjoyed telling a better story. It was it actually when as I was reading it, I was thinking this is a varied approach. There's not you've got the inside out method inside, but you show how it works out in different situations and conversations depending on who you're talking to and being attuned to people and listening. Uh, Rethink Yourself for me is an example of taking one of those areas and fleshing it out in a book. So when I was starting to work on this, it you know we one of the challenges we face as Christians in the West in the 21st century is that the dominant approach, worldview, philosophy of life, understanding of the purpose of life is summed up in the term given by some sociologists called expressive individualism. That the purpose of life is to find yourself and to express yourself, to be true to yourself above all else, no matter what religious authorities might say or what your previous generation might say, parents, family, friends, anyone. You be you, you do you. You've got to chase your dreams and chart your own path forward. A lot of that just passes for common sense in our day and age. And so I did a chapter in This Is Our Time several years ago on this this very subject. And I knew, and I told people that picked up This Is Our Time, I think that's the most important chapter in the book, the North Pole and the Pursuit of Happiness, because some of the surveys and some of the statistics that I was pointing to in there really show just how dominant this way of thinking is in our society. I mean, when 90-something% of Americans say that to find yourself, you have to look inside yourself, this is just widespread common sense, right? So Rethink Yourself, I wanted to take that one idea, the expressive individualism, but to unpack it in a way that wouldn't use terms like that. Because, how many of us walking around with, college students or teenagers or people in their 20s or 30s who are using terms like expressive individualism? I also didn't want to assume Bible knowledge on the part of the reader. I wanted this to be the kind of book that would do two things. It would provide a model for pastors who are wanting to explain some of these concepts in a way that would be memorable and helpful and accessible for just anybody, who's listening. So I wanted to help pastors and church leaders, college ministers in their communication of the gospel within this sort of ethos and environment. That was one thing. So there's a model aspect there. But then I also wanted it to be just a good, useful discipleship tool, so that if you were to hand it to someone in your congregation who is probably more formed by the be true to yourself mindset than you even realize, that maybe it's a Christian, but they not as discipled as they could be, that you'd hand the book to them and they'd be able to understand it, follow, track with it all the way through, or someone who's not even part of the Christian faith, but who's interested. I definitely had a very evangelistic heart with this book. One of my constant prayers over the last few months has been that someone would come to faith as a result of having gone through this work, read this book. But just in a nutshell, the idea of, well, how do you, I was struck with this idea at the beginning, or this question: how do I explain expressive individualism in a way that lays it out to where it's accessible and understandable for people, where they see themselves in it and they say, yeah, that's me. I'm the one who's chasing this dream, or following my heart in this way, or wanting to look inside and discover who I am and wanting to put that on display for people. How do I explain that to someone in a way that they resonate with it? But then there's also some hooks to remember things, and then to show a contrast with the biblical view. And so the approach I came up with was this idea of expressive individualism has you in terms of priority. You look in, and then around, and then up. You look inside yourself to find, to discover yourself, to define who you are. You look around to display yourself to other people, to get their affirmation and acceptance and approval. And then if you still feel like you need a spiritual dimension in life, you look up to God or some higher power, to some kind of spiritual discipline. In terms of priority, you look in first, then around, and then up. That is the dominant way that many people in our society view the purpose of life, whether or not they would ever articulate it that way. Then in the book, what I do is I show that that's not common sense for people in other parts of the world. Certainly hasn't been common sense for many people throughout history. The dominant worldview for many people in other parts of the world would be that you look around first to the community. It's a we before me kind of a mindset where the community defines you and your role in the community. And then you look up to God or to some sacred order, connection to ancestors, all sorts of other ways. There's some sort of sacred order that's underpinning who you are supposed to be. And then within that sort of confined framework, you look in and you can have a certain freedom that comes with that. So looking around first is the mindset of many people in our world. But the Bible actually challenges both of those views, because the Bible has us look up first to God, to his design, to us understanding that we are to be a display of his glory, to be made in his image, that our purpose is found, our identity is established in relationship to him. So we look up first, then around to the community of faith that both affirms us in our faith, but also gives us aspiration to grow in our faith, to become more like Christ, to put away the old nature and the sin nature, and to put on Christ as we grow in sanctification. And then we look in at the end to the unique person that God has created us to be, who is, I like to say, you are the image that the Bible has of salvation at the end is not that you are less of yourself, but that you are both more of yourself and more like Christ than you could ever imagine that you would be. So to be more like Christ doesn't mean that I'm becoming less Trevin or less Josh, but that I am more Trevin than I was before, because I'm the sinful, selfish sides of me are being burned away, and I am more myself and more like Jesus in bringing a unique display of his glory and to who he made me to be. So the book kind of walks through that. I'm doing a lot of what Josh talked about, Pascal. There is a bit of that apologetics of despair mindset where you're laying out how certain this way of life that you may have adopted, never even thought of before, that the purpose of life is to find yourself, express yourself, be true to yourself, that it doesn't work, that there's a lot of problems with it. And so I'm gently throughout the book trying to point out some of those problems to, the old illustration of putting the pebble in someone's shoe, so that they'll be thinking, well, maybe this way of life isn't what it's cracked up to be. Only then to come alongside with the Bible to show there is a different way of approaching life. There is a better way of approaching life, to bring the gospel to bear on that. And so that's the goal and really the heart behind Rethink Yourself, the book.
Trevin, one of the things I like about the book is you clearly have background here in kind of high level scholarship with names like Robert Bellah and Charles Taylor and a whole host of others, but you really haven't written a book for the audiences that would read those books. You've written a book for the church, and you've written it free of jargon in a way that people can understand. I mean, I think it's a great little book for discipleship groups, for group studies. I also think just even taking it with an unbeliever who's kind of wrapped into this it's a great kind of initial point for somebody to begin to think about, okay, what have I taken as common sense, which maybe is part of the problem. And in the midst of COVID and depression rates rising and people are desperate, I think it's a great time to say, hey, let's talk about, the air we're all breathing that's maybe part of the problem here. So I would commend it on those terms.
Well, I appreciate that, Josh. So anyway, that is an overview of both of our books, and I will say that what Josh was saying about some of the deeper scholarship behind some of these things, some of these books and authors are really worth reading. People like Charles Taylor, Robert Bellah, and whatnot. And you'll get some of that translated down, so to speak, in Josh's work, where he is explaining and expounding on some of their ideas and concepts. For me, because I am trying to do, I created a discipleship tool that is free of that kind of jargon. If you're a church leader that's interested in going deeper into some of those concepts, look at the footnotes, because I've got a ton of footnotes. There's a lot in there. They're actually at the back of the book, end notes. I know some people hate end notes, but in order to keep it free of jargon for the average reader, I wanted to put a lot of that deeper stuff in the back so that those who did, church leaders especially, who wanted to go deeper on some of those things could look at that. But we are at the time now where we're going to go ahead and jump into some of the questions that we've selected from the list. And again, thank you all for joining us. We hope that this is going to be a helpful time where we're going to be able to speak to some of the challenges and opportunities we have as we look at the next generation coming up and how to do ministry among them and how to do apologetics specifically. So let's start off with a question that came up several times. Josh, if you can help us understand, what are the major objections to the gospel among people who belong to Gen Z? If we're looking at Gen Z, we're looking at some of the obstacles, some of the objections that we have. What are some of the major ones that you see?
Yeah, I mean, so you have things that I just want to, like, for the first one I'll mention is evil and suffering, which is a perennial problem, a perennial challenge for Christianity that is often has long been levied against Christianity. So I mentioned that. I think there's tons of good resources. I deal with it in a chapter in the book. But I think one of the unique things about Gen Z is that they find themselves in a cultural climate that has changed, and has changed from the assumed climate by which a lot of apologetic approaches and engagement kind of discipleship approaches are still working on, which is it kind of assumes a kind of warmth towards Christian society. In other words, 50 or 60 years ago, it was, is this really true? But even if it's not true, Christianity is good for society. It's a good thing. You want to find some religion, it will bring kind of morality. And so if you're struggling in life, maybe you go see what the church has to offer. But now the particular objections are rooted in not just simply is this true, but is it good and is it beautiful? And so now this objection is Christianity is not just neutral, but it's actually oppressive. It's actually dehumanizing. And then connected with that is the objection that Christians lack virtue. They don't live good lives. They're not good people. And there's the history of Christianity that, of course, they will bring up, and also they sadly have an example in current context. So these objections that really kind of hover around the goodness and the beauty of Christianity is something that I think, and again, a lot of times we focused on the truth because we could, because the goodness and beauty could be almost taken for granted in certain contexts. Increasingly, especially with Gen Z, that's no longer taken for granted.
Yeah, I was going to say something. Yeah, I was going to say something related to morality. Like, I do think in previous generations, some of the supernatural claims of Christianity were obstacles for people. Like there was a time 75 years ago or so, or where 50 years ago even, where and even in you think of the latter half of the last century, a lot of apologetic strategies were related to, well, how can we provide a case for miracles, right? That these things that have happened in the Bible, why we could believe them. And so, and I think those are still questions that Gen Z would ask. But there's been quite to the extent some apologetic strategies in previous generations were, well, let's not focus so much on miracles then, because that's a hang up. Let's focus on the morality the brotherhood of man, the fatherhood of God, those kinds of things. But what's actually happened now is things have flipped a bit. There isn't as much objection to believing that crazy things can happen in this world that we live in. Now the morality is under question more so than the miracles. And again, every student's different, every person's different. So you'll find both objections, but the question of Christian morality being harmful and repressive and bad rather than just odd, that is a new objection that is something that we're dealing with. But more so than any objection, I would just say this, and Josh, I'd be curious to see if you agree. I think one of the biggest obstacles we face with the next generation is not that when we talk about objections, and I saw that this question came up several times. Talking about objections is really good because we do want to answer those objections. But if we're not careful, we can give the impression that the next generation is just overtly hostile to the gospel, that they already come with all of these objections. There are some like that, but the statistics and surveys and things that I see, not to mention just anecdotal conversations and whatnot, is that there's more of an indifference, maybe a little bit of intrigue into Christianity, or a question of its relevance more so than sort of these I'm coming with guns loaded, like we're coming as apologists into this battle with this person who's got all this armor up against Christianity. In my experience, a lot of the majority of Gen Z is not in that category. They're more in the why should I care category. So they've got so many other things that they're thinking about or talking about or distracted with that it's not so much that they're coming loaded with objections, but that the objections come after the interest is actually there. Do you agree with that, Josh?
In part, I mean, there is an apathy that's real, but I sense a difference in probably Raleigh and Nashville and Seattle. I mean, I think in some places it's like almost it's weird and seems oppressive, but it's like, I haven't met an evangelical, it's kind of what I haven't met a Christian. So, are they out there? I think there's a sense of loss still with a lot of people who have, the deconversion stories and that kind of anger at the church that I hear from people who've deconverted or at least kind of grown up in kind of the Bible Belt type culture where there's some passion there and almost even a haunting, to borrow from Flannery O'Connor at that point. It's still kind of they're haunted by Christ. They're not Christ-centric, but they feel a loss in a way that kind of Augustine did when he's writing Confessions, and Monica had kind of, it was there in the background, and I still see that a lot, even though they're pretty ticked off. But that's of course one of the things we're getting at is that the cultural studies are helpful because they're giving us a kind of map, but then there's always the individual person that you're talking to, and so if you assume too much, then you won't actually respond in a way that is going to care for them and really get at what's going on with them. And so you just can't assume. You've got to actually know how to have conversation and have cultural intelligence and care about somebody. Let me bridge this and ask you something, Trevin. I think it relates. How do we, one of the questions that we got a lot is how do we help Gen Z understand truth and certainty when feelings and the kind of fake news and the polarization seems to dominate so much of culture?
Yeah, this is a big question. There was a book that came out a couple of years ago called The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. And this book talks about these great big untruths or myths that are prevalent in our society, but increasingly so among Gen Z. So what's interesting about that book is that they actually see a shift in college students from the sort of the latter portion of the millennials and then those who are coming into college who had grown up with where in their formative years they had iPhone access. So in like middle school and high school, there's a book called iGen that actually divides up and says maybe we should be thinking of Gen Z from about 1995 on, because there is such a watershed sort of cultural shift that happens when in your formative years of middle school and high school, you are tethered to an iPhone or to a smartphone of some sort. And so we have a lot of work to do here, because one of the things that Haidt and Lukyanov point out is that college campuses have changed a lot in response to this fact that a lot of students that are arriving on campus have certain expectations that have been formed over many years. And they also have a good degree of skepticism as to anyone's narrative, so to speak, or anyone's truth claim. And because of that, there's a paradoxical thing going on. There's a certain amount of built-in skepticism because they sort of are jaded, sometimes cynical, have seen a lot. But then there's this also really powerful impulse toward justice and toward some kind of truth that they feel like they have grabbed onto, some kind of cause that is righteous in a way. And so they expect everyone else to be on board with that agenda. This is not the majority, and this is one of the things that the book shows out. This is not the majority of college students, but it is a vocal segment of college students. And so one of the things that I'm thinking we're going to have to do in our churches is prepare people for those great that they won't buy into those great big myths that Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff talk about, the myth of us versus them, like where everything is sort of a battle it's a zero-sum game, it's a battle to the death over a principle, or the idea of the myth that we used to say that whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? You grow through pain. There's the myth that actually no, pain makes you weaker, and so that we should avoid pain at all costs, or avoid being offended, or avoid the exchange of ideas and things. Unless we are attuned to how our own kids, grandkids, or students in our churches are being formed in a certain way, we're going to be sending students off to college in the future, or from college into jobs and careers and whatnot, and are not going to be, they're not going to be equipped for that, either the environment, the sort of bubble of college, where a lot of unrest and controversy can take place, or the real life world that doesn't live in that college bubble and expecting it to be like that after they are there. So I think for us to help Gen Z in answer to the question, understand truth and certainty when in the era of feelings and fake news and whatnot, it's not by denying that there's fake news out there. It's not by denying the importance of feelings. Feelings are important. They can be a starting point in a lot of conversations. I think instead it's going to be for us looking at the overall formative experiences that we have with our kids, and then beginning to lead and guide them and shape them in a way that they'll be prepared when they confront some of these great myths that are prevalent among college campuses. And I know we have questions that get to technology a little bit later that we'll get to, but Josh, what would you say in answer to that question?
Yeah, I would say that there's a tendency to respond by unhelpfully going to the other extreme to this. And I think you picked up on it by saying, oh yeah, well, is there truth? Is there absolute truth? Is there are you absolutely certain? And so we give this myth in the midst of pluralism, in the midst of all these kind of cross pressures that students are feeling, that there's some kind of secret recipe so that you can have a kind of, absolute proof argument, a silver bullet argument, that once you get that argument, you're good to go. And then I think what happens is in a well-meaning desire to help them and protect them, what you end up doing is they're like kind of their house of faith is built on maybe one argument or achieving absolute certainty through that one argument in a very rationalistic way, in a very hard rationalistic way, that once they actually realize that there's smart atheists out there who've heard that
Moral
argument and are
atheists
convinced.
too.
Do what?
Moral atheists too. Like,
Moral atheists, smart atheists. They don't all look like characters, on the movie God's Not Dead. And then when they realize that, it's kind of it's a shock to this. It's an existential shock to the system. And when they realize that actually there's smart people who have heard that, proof, and they're not convinced by it, then what it does is, and then they look at Christian leaders and behavior. It's this kind of recipe for beginning to really have some doubts and struggles. And I think part of the issue is how we've represented, what Christianity is. I think Christianity is the most compelling worldview, the most compelling story, and it makes existential sense. It makes real rational sense. But what it isn't is it's not this silver bullet argument that we just logic chop our way to in a way we might add up a math equation. And it seems to me that in some of the ways that we've approached this in trying to help people, we've actually created some big problems. And so hear me say this: I'm all for apologetics. I mean, I've spent the last, many years working on this, but it's also about having the right posture that we approach our students with, and teaching them the right posture for faith. And that's not simply a dump truck of arguments. There's more to it than that. Yeah. So I'm in agreement with you, Trevin, and I just wanted to talk about it as far as some things to look out for there.
Well, that leads really well into this next question. One of the several people ask this as well. What are the biggest factors underlying young people's doubt about God? How do we minister to Gen Z in the midst of doubt? As we look at, and I mean, this would be true of millennials as well, not just Gen Z,
Yeah.
but just young people in general. What are the underlying factors that are creating doubt? And then how do we minister in a way where people don't feel certain of their faith or have all sorts of questions and doubts?
Yeah. Well, I think some of the factors is that I've already mentioned. So just to go through, I mean, one, there's a growing mistrust of authority, and there's a growing mistrust of Christian authority. And that, yeah, that's inevitable given what we've seen. And then the kind of, again, technology plays into this. There's material causes. There's a pluralistic culture. So you have competing authorities that attack the credibility of each other. There's so much information flying around, but not a whole lot of wisdom to be able to process and understand. And so there's a growing mistrust of the church, a growing mistrust of their youth leader, of their pastors. Do they really know what they're talking about? In a way that before the internet, for instance, it was growing because of certain things, but internet certainly heightened that. They're Googling you as you're giving your youth talk. Is what he said, actually right? And I assume that because I did that with my lectures, and folks still do that to me when I teach. So I've already mentioned the other one. There's a wrong kind of notions about rationality. And so oftentimes for people who get your students, and for college students, high school students who get on the kind of intellectual track, which I think there's an anti-intellectualism within the church. And when they see that makes them run the other way. And on the other hand, when they get on this track, sometimes they can begin imagining that they are just kind of logic processors, and that that they're just kind of brains on a stick, and they're just computing, and they're trying to approach Christianity and the big questions of life like they would approach shallow questions in life. Science is great; it answers lots of kind of small questions, but it doesn't answer the big questions. And if you try to force science to answer the big questions or that kind of methodology of life, you end up with a very reductionistic approach to life in a way that Christianity and other philosophies don't actually work with. And so there needs to be a lot of thought given to, okay, has this person, in adopting an intellectualism, which is good, also bought into certain kinds of faulty forms of intellectualism, a hard rationalism that you need to actually learn to deal with before you just start giving him, well, here's a dump truck of evidence that I found on the internet. He's likely to go to another site and find a dump truck of evidence against that.
Right.
So that's the situation we face. And so what we really need is to understand kind of this, what I keep referring to as a social imagination, what's going on, what are the assumptions they're making that are causing these doubts. And then we begin to help them to begin to doubt their doubts. Because in order to doubt something, you have to believe something else. We're all faith-seeking understanding. And so to doubt something about God or Christianity, it means you're believing something else. So to learn to dig under that and be pastoral with people, and to get at these bigger assumptions is both what Trevin and I are trying to do and trying to teach people to do.
Yeah, I
Trevin,
think I think that pastoral tone is set for us in Jude, which tells us to have mercy on those who doubt. Doubt is not necessarily the enemy of faith. I mean, there's different kinds of doubt. Don't get me wrong. So, sometimes there is doubt that is genuine, heartfelt, concerned. There is a kind of doubt that is that does happen among some students that is really what I call unbelief. It's not faith seeking understanding, it's unbelief seeking justification, right? Like I can point to these doubts that I have so that I can reject Christianity from an intellectual standpoint, because in the end of the day, I want to live the way I want to live, right? Yeah. We shouldn't, the heart has its reasons, both good and both bad, on what's happening. And so there's no one answer to that question, because every person is unique, and every conversation you're having, you've got to discern what kind of doubt are we dealing with here, and then how do we talk through what should our posture be. And I've always, for the most part, when I've had conversations with students that have good questions, there's a couple of things you can do wrong. One of them is to say, well, you know what, you shouldn't be asking these tough questions. You just got to believe. So that's what faith is, just believing, But I've heard of many pastors that take that approach, that maybe because they feel like these questions are a distraction, or maybe because they don't feel equipped to answer them themselves. And there's no shame in that. Not every pastor can be an expert on every single question that someone might raise. But there's no shame in saying, you know what, let me do a little bit of digging on that. Let me reflect on that question. Let me come back with, and later follow up. There's no problem with that. But I think some pastors have pushed off legitimate, good questions because they might not have felt, equipped to answer them, or they have felt like it's a distraction. The better response, and one that I've tried to use that I hope is, and has definitely been good, at least in conversation, keeping conversation going with young people as they've asked questions, has been to give a good answer about doubt in general, to say, doubting can make your faith stronger. I love that you're asking these questions. I love that you're really, because especially for students, when students are asking good questions for me, and I'll always encourage them and say, this is a sign that you want to own your faith, And so that's like, you're not just answering, you're not just receiving the Sunday school simple answers that you've grown up with. You want to dig into them, and you want to press into some of these questions themselves, and then to walk through what some of those doubts are with a posture of openness, learning, humility, the willingness to come back to discuss things I may not have an immediate answer for. To me, that will go farther without feeling like we're almost offended by doubts and questions that get raised. If someone in our church is questioning the biblical understanding of marriage, for example, and sexuality, I should expect they're going to ask that question, not be offended or surprised when they ask that question. If they're asking the why behind the what of what it is we believe. And I think that's got to be the case with a number of things.
Yeah, I think that there can be what I find is there's a way to help people by just the calm that you have. Like, hey, I'm not surprised, I'm not shocked by this question, and I can understand why you would have it. And let's explore this together. That is a discipleship moment. And the discipleship moment isn't, let me tell you why they're wrong and how this is dangerous. It might be dangerous, but reacting in a way that, what I'm trying to get at is reacting in a way, and certainly you might need to tell them, hey, I'm worried this is dangerous eventually, but I'm saying reacting in a way that seems overly defensive. I mean, students are going to pick up on that. I mean, they're going to pick up on, oh, wow, he was really flustered there. She was really flustered there. And rather than kind of having this calming presence, and that means you have thought about these things. You've got to work to stay ahead of your students on these things and have been given some thought to it, even though, of course, there's always times where we're like, hey, we got to come back to you on that. But speaking of asking questions, I mean, one of the ways to get at this is not simply receiving questions, but asking questions. So, Trevin, what are some helpful questions to ask to discern kind of where they're at, what kind of big story maybe that they've unwittingly found themselves in, and what's causing some of these doubts? I mean, what are some of these kind of questions?
This question about what story that we're living in is one that I think it's important for us to help Gen Z discern kind of what their big dreams are, their aspirations, how they view the world, their timeline, their career, what it is that they're living for. But honestly, I think we've got to all do work on this, and this is not just a generational thing. I think we've got to do the work on this for ourselves as, whatever generation we're a part of. We've got to be asking good questions about what is it that is fueling our imagination and is leading us as we think through the future. So I've just got a few questions that I generally find to be helpful conversation starters to help discern what might be the motivating thing in that student's life. One is if you were to take 10 minutes to talk about the last 10 years of your life, how would you tell the story? Just hearing people talk about their life and how they see their life, it's fascinating. The things that they mention will tell you how they see the drama and the narrative of how their life has been unfolding. Because we all live within a story of some sort, and the way that they tell that story gives a lot of input into, or gives a lot of insight into how that person is conceiving of their life. Here's another one. If you're telling that story, like what in the telling of that story, what is a setback versus a step forward? Because the way that a person is plotting the trajectory of their life, if, for example, if their whole life is career focused, career driven, maybe they were an athlete in school and now they're on a sports scholarship in college, and maybe they're moving forward, and you're talking to someone and they're telling you their story in a way that really emphasizes that they live in the sports narrative of performance, right? Well, then the setback and the step forward is going to be this injury, or this was a great moment, or this is how they move forward. Same thing can be said about a career. The way people talk about sometimes political parties, you'll find that people that are just enmeshed with their story is sort of intersecting with the political party that they belong to, and sort of a partisan story of where the great drama in life is happening in Washington, D.C. And they're just they're up on all the podcasts, all the blogs, all the Twitter, like social media, cable news, whatever it is. If they're like just enmeshed in that kind of environment, they'll tell stories related to their to how they think about steps forward or steps back in relation to that. A couple of other questions sometimes you can discern someone's story is in moments of quiet, where does your mind run to first? Like, what do you think? What do you think about when you're not having to think about anything? Another one would be, what are your biggest hopes for the next 10 years? And then the corresponding one to that are, what are the biggest fears you have for the next 10 years? I think what that question illuminates dramatic tension in the way that someone is conceiving of their life story. Another one would be, and if you want to understand how someone is seeing themselves in relation to a community of some sort, you can ask the question of, what group of people is most important to you in fulfilling those hopes, or in helping you avoid those things you fear might happen, So you ask the hopes and fears questions, and then you come alongside and you get some insight into what community is this person a part of? Do they think of anyone? Do they think of family? Do they think of church? Do they think of people in their school or class or on their team or whatnot? And then another question would just be, what do you value most in life? And you to hear the answer to that question, and then to also ask the question, is there a difference in between what you say you value the most and and how you spend your time? Because that's a big question, I think, for all of us to answer. But it helps you to be able to see underlying tensions in the way someone is thinking of their life story, telling their life story. If you have a conversation that asks some of those questions with someone, you really get to know how they see their life, and may be able to bring some good challenge, and to see some opportunities as well in engaging them further in a spiritual conversation, just by going through those questions.
Kind of my go-to question is, tell me your story. I mean, and then just with my ears perked up, I want to hear where they're tapping meaning, and where they're going for love, and where they're, what their morality system is. And I also find that it's refreshing for people. I think that we don't take the time to attend to people anymore. And I think in some sense, we've lost, in our busyness and our frantic pace and our rush to size people up by, their political affiliation or with some label. I think it's actually quite refreshing when somebody slows down and says, "Hey, tell me your story. I care about you." I mean I think that just alone is a type of apologetic of attending that in the midst of programming, in the midst of preparing for the next talk, are we doing as leaders? Are you attending to your students?
That's great. Josh, one of the questions that came in, this is talking about specifically a question related to your book. So in part 2 of Telling a Better Story, you give 5 models of the inside out approach. You talk about imagining a better meaning, self, happiness, inclusiveness, and reason. If you were to write another chapter to that section, what would you have written on, and why, what, if you were one in addition to those?
Yeah, I like this question because somebody read the book, so you always feel good about that, right? And I would also, just for those of you who haven't read it, is what I'm trying to do in that second section is take these common assumptions and even aspirations of a late modern. So where are people at? And they're looking for meaning. You might say, "Hey, somebody might say I'm an agnostic or I'm an atheist," but okay, they're still going to make meaning. That's what we do as humans. That's part of, they're going to go search for meaning, and they're going to go have some kind of identity, whether it's, as you've explained, Trevin, in community or in achievement, in meritocracy, and in romance. They're going to try to find some kind of identity. And so in light of that, I'm saying, yeah, okay, let's learn how to talk about that then. Everyone's going to do it. So it's part of human nature. People are, the classic question, what the good life is, where is happiness found? That's what it means to be human. We're going to try to be happy. So let's just talk about that. There's a modern aspiration is inclusiveness. We want to be inclusive. So let's start there. What story gives us the best inclusiveness? And of course, rationality. I think we do want to be rational beings. We do ask questions of the world, and we expect answers. And so, yeah, what story best explains? But to get at another chapter, I would say I picked up on this on happiness, but I think where I would add another one is a chapter on love. and although I made it a subsection of this chapter on happiness, it's so dominant that we want to, as human beings, we want to love and we want to be loved. And it doesn't matter who you are. And that's such a great place to start. I mean, in some sense, this is where Augustine started in Confessions, this desire to be loved, and yet this restlessness that remains. And maybe the other one would be peace, that, we want peace, and yet how do we get peace without dominating others? How do we get peace without one group saying, this is how it's going to be? And I think exploring these things, exploring peace and love, really, again, there's an opportunity to talk about what it really means to be human. And I think Jesus has some pretty darn good answers. So it allows us to get to Jesus's answers on these things. Trevin, you got what chapter should I have added?
No, I think those are good. I mean, those are, it's always the question. You always love getting questions like that. First, because someone has read the book, but secondly, you're also wondering, should I have written a different book or a different, more chapters to the book but I think the 5 that you've got are really good ones, but those would make sense to add to it.
I wonder the other one maybe would be shame. I just thought about this,
Yeah.
But I mean, I deal with guilt. So I deal with guilt in the chapter, but it seems to be shame. We used to say you can't talk about guilt anymore because people don't feel guilty, but I'm not so much buying that. I think a lot of our outworkings of different things is ultimately because we still have this abiding sense of guilt. We can do more. We should be doing more. So maybe shame and guilt I would talk more about that.
That's true.
So Trevin, how much should we think? Here's a question that often pops up. How much should we think of evangelism to Gen Z in individual terms versus the kind of church's corporate and public witness with evangelism?
Yeah, no, that's an important question. I mean, I think obviously both of them need to be together. We want to share the gospel individually with people, but we do need to recognize the power of the church as a formative community. Mm-hmm. Leslie Newbigin, the missionary theologian, talked about the church as the apologetic of the gospel itself, as that the church itself is a community that is in itself the fact that it exists, the fact that it's a worshiping community is bearing witness to the gospel. So I think the importance of church cannot be underestimated. I was looking at some statistics recently, and I'm going to write about this at the beginning of the year, about how the majority of students that grow up through our youth ministries and go to our churches, church-going Christian young people, take at least a gap year of a year or maybe more off at some point during their 20s from church. A large number of those. Now, I mean, you probably hear these terrible statistics about 80% of our young people leave the church never to return. And I'm thinking, how would you know never to return? Are they all dead? How do you even, but, is the 80 or 90% number, is that even right? It's not quite that high, but it's still very sobering. The statistic is sobering as to how many people do leave. Now, there is a good number of those, a high percentage that do trickle back into church in their sort of the late 20s, if you look at the statistics and research. But think about the missed opportunity, though, if during some of the most formative decision-making years of a student's life, they're not surrounded by the people of God, right? That should weigh on us, I think. And so when we think about discipleship and evangelism, and both of these obviously go together, we've got 2 fronts to this battle that are before us. One is making sure that we actually are keeping young people that have grown up in church, that have made profession of faith, that want to live for Jesus, being surrounded by people who that community helps retain the plausibility of their Christian faith in a communal way. That's vitally important. Most young people do not leave the faith because they went to college and they had a mean atheistic professor like in God's Not Dead. More people may drift from the faith because they went to college and they stopped going to church. And it wasn't that they just made this conscious decision of, I'm not going to attend a church anymore, but it was this sort of drifting away from the community of faith. That's the bigger sort of elephant in the room from a discipleship standpoint. From an evangelistic standpoint, inviting someone to church is not the same thing as evangelism, but it's still powerful. If the church is a community apologetic, then connecting people into a community of people who believe in Jesus, who are seeking to live, to follow Jesus, to live according to the gospel, who bear the fragrance of the Savior. That has as much of an effect as any apologetics arguments we might make. In fact, evangelism is best when it is done individually, and there is this corporate dimension to where they can see and imagine this reality, this community that they're being invited into. And so I think both of those, for evangelism, of course, individual conversations matter, but let's not underestimate the importance of the church and the importance of the apologetic impact of a community of faith that really does believe that Jesus Christ came out of the grave on Easter morning and is ordering their corporate life together accordingly.
Yeah, and I think I would just piggyback that and say, and then a leadership that therefore believes in the power of the central message. I mean, I think one of the issues here is that we in our ministries can sometimes we buy into the glitz and glamour of needing to compete in a consumeristic culture, and then what we end up doing is we make very good consumers rather than disciples, and that is going to be an issue long term for their spiritual health, for their faith, and so one of the things that we have to do is, I think as leaders, we have to ask some tough questions of ourselves. And you already alluded to this earlier, Trevin, but what story are we actually living in? Are we so consumed with an achievement model in our own ministries that yes, we want to be fruitful, but there's this achievement to have the most students and to accomplish these certain things, that we actually create an environment which is really keyed on consumerism, and that's not going to create students who can suffer well, who can deal with the challenges that come. So I think that we have to ask ourselves some tough questions about our own lives and what stories we're living in, and then also about our own ministries, and kind of deal with some of that before we're actually in a position to serve them in these kinds of situations. So I think there's a temptation there we have to be aware of. And we've been talking about so far kind of apologetics, evangelism, particularly to students. But of course, we're also, key in all this is working with parents, because parents are going to be the day in and day out, Lord willing, they're going to be the day in and day out formative influence on their kids. So what are some of the, Trevin, I'm going to ask you, what are some of the specific Gen Z related challenges to parenting that we need to address?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it makes sense that we would shift a little bit to parenting. A lot of questions came in along the lines of parenting. I can think of two pretty big ones, just specific Gen Z related parenting challenges. The first is, as a Christian parent, you cannot expect that the ethos of the culture is in any way going to be an ally to you. So I say that it's specific Gen Z because for many people, at least in certain parts of the country, as millennials, Gen X, and beyond, the baby boomers for sure, there was still a sense in which if you wanted to inculcate Christian truth into your kids, you could expect some help from certain cultural dynamics. Okay, so the respectability of church attendance and being a religious person, for example, or the fact that you wouldn't have soccer games on Sunday morning during your worship service time, like they're, or that the idea that being a religious person is part of being a good person, being a moral person. Having religious beliefs is a plus, brings you social capital rather than cost you something. These are things that have been changing over the generations. So, and depending on where you live in the country, there's certainly been a shift. But even in like the Bible Belt areas now, there is a market shift into where we can't. One of the challenges that we have with Gen Z is this expectation that there's going to be any sense of ally with just cultural dynamics in preserving and passing on the Christian faith to our kids. It's not going to be there. In fact, you should go ahead and be expecting resistance. So, for example, I mentioned earlier about to not be surprised if students don't just immediately understand the framing for a Christian view of marriage and sexuality. Well, why not? Well, because everything in the culture now in the world is actually pushing in a different frame for what marriage and sexuality and relationships are all about. And so you're going to get resistance from the culture from things that would have been commonplace even 15 years ago, 20 years ago, that wouldn't have had a social cost to them. There will be a social cost. So one of the challenges is not just explaining to our kids what it is we believe and teaching them this is what we believe, but in explaining why, having good answers for the why we believe what we believe on certain questions that my grandparents would have never had to answer. Okay. Mm-hmm. I think that's the first big challenge. The second one is just technology, related to technology. And this again goes back to what we said about iGen, the distinguishing marks between the older millennials and the older Gen Z crowd is really the prevalence of the smartphone, the online connectedness, the social drama never ending. You're not without it when you come home from school. The drama continues because you're never really off. You're performing sort of all the time. How technology has changed in online connectedness and social media has changed our relationships, the way we conceive of our identities, the fluidity with which we think of our identities has been affected, at least at some level, by social media, because it does make it easier for us to invent and reinvent ourselves multiple times in the adolescent years, which are very crucial identity forming years of life. So the technology, I think the outside cultural forces are presenting some unique challenges for Gen Z, but then technology is the other big one. It's just those questions and those things we're having to deal with as parents of Gen Z are things that our parents did not have to ask, did not have to wrestle with, and we're having to figure out our way through, knowing that we're probably making a lot of mistakes on the way as we do this and as we see how this goes. Josh, what do you think? Any you would add to that?
Yeah, I would just say Andy Crouch, TechWise family. That's mine. Andy's done us all a favor of doing that work, and he's come out recently published another one with his daughter who I believe is in college. I think My TechWise Life or something along the lines. Sorry, Andy, if I'm getting that wrong if you hear this, but look up TechWise family. And I would just say for folks who are especially student ministers watching this, you need to help your parents and students think through this, because it's the technology bit is forming us. I'll say one more thing. It's like my colleague here in Raleigh used this illustration from a book. He said, if you go out and all of a sudden you start using a shovel every day for hours and hours, what's going to happen is, of course, it's going to change you physically, right? It's going to change. You're going to have calluses and blisters, and it's going to change you. If you are constantly looking at a phone and a screen, which we all are, in certain ways, it's going to change you. And to act like it's not is, we can't ignore that. And we're all in this boat together. But it's just I think it's a huge issue in how it's forming our feelings, our character, and something we've got to address, and we got to do a better job here. as the church.
Yeah, I saw someone joke over Thanksgiving holiday on Twitter saying something like, "Well, this is vacation season now, which means I can take a break from my medium-sized screen in order to pay closer attention to my little screen while I'm watching a big screen." Like
Yeah.
just sort of like I'm closing my laptop, so I'll have my phone and then I'll be watching, Netflix or whatever. And I thought that's probably a pretty good example of what a lot of people feel like their life is just sort of from screen to screen.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of C.S. Lewis, and he talks about just going for a walk, be careful, and how that just experiencing beauty and experiencing nature is really it's an apologetic. I mean, I think a lot of we're so turned in on ourselves, to use an Augustinian phrase, and then actually quite literally turned in on our phone, that it's going to affect our ability to see the world and see what God's doing and be moved by beauty. And that, I believe, beauty and truth and goodness are tied together. And when we close ourselves off from the beauty of nature and creation, and we don't warn our students and our families about that, then it also closes them up to the truth and beauty and goodness of the Christian story. And so simple things like just enjoying, a coffee and having a conversation with someone and attending to the world, attending to others, I think is a very basic place for us to start.
Yeah, the iPhone. I mean, our phones are not. They do form us because they everything about them is geared to us and to our preferences, right? And so, I mean, every time one of the reasons we are turned inward onto our phones is because our phones are constantly telling us that we're the center of the universe. Everything about our phone is meant to serve us, right? So we're the master of this universe, and by flipping around apps and whatnot, it's like we're moving around worlds and things we could enter. But another question related to this is, it says technology is a big deal for young people. Yes, it is. Is it worthwhile to use social media and technology to reach Gen Z? What are effective means of reaching a digital generation? What do you think about? I mean, obviously, these are tools. Can they be used for good in reaching and connecting with Gen Z?
Yeah. Yeah, as we're appearing on a screen. I mean, and obviously, I hope everyone knows this as you're listening, that Trevin and I aren't saying there's not a place for exactly what we're doing right now, appearing on a screen. I mean, during COVID, right, where churches were on screens, and so, yeah, I think technology is a tool. I think the question has been that we're posing: are we using it, or is it using us? Are we really in control? And the secret that we're coming to learn is that we're not in control. It's an illusion of control that we think, as you were just describing, that we are in control. And don't we love that? Isn't this so much of what the Enlightenment was about, and the really what can draw our hearts of back from Genesis 3 is you can be God, you can be in control, but it is all an illusion, because we're coming to find out actually the algorithms are controlling us, and it's a lie. And so it sucks us in with the illusion of control, while at the same time actually putting us under its control. And marketing forces and political forces have learned that and learned how to leverage that. And so what it's created is this, the polarization, all of these things that now we find ourselves actually in control. So again, I'm being negative. How can we use it? That was the question. Sorry.
That was the question was, can we use it for good?
Which I'm wanting to say yes, but I would want to use it in a way that, in ideal circumstances, obviously we're in this kind of crazy year of the COVID tide, but you're using it to draw people out, right? So they're going to be on it. I'm a realist. They're going to be on it. How do we limit, as parents, as with our kids, how do we limit that? How do we manage that? Because there's some good things about that, right? I can, I can track where my kid is, when it's time, and they can call me if something happens when they're out, and those are good things, right? And you can find information. That's a good thing. But what I'm wanting to suggest as a ministry is we're using those as doorways to ultimately pull them away from simply a digitalized me-centered world and pull them out into nature in the world. And so again, COVID, we're having to adapt, and I'm not suggesting stuff like what we're doing here is wrong, but I do think, especially as we get Lord willing, we get vaccines and things improve, that we're using it as a tool, well aware of the dangers. And so, yeah, absolutely, use it as a tool, but we better be aware of the dangers and pitfalls.
Yeah, and I think there are some ways to use it. I mean, I think if you're a minister to college students or to a youth pastor, to be able to be on social media connecting via Facebook or Twitter, mainly Instagram now, I would say would be the dominant one for that age group. You see a lot about your young people and are able to have different connection points than you might not have known, which can tailor then your preaching and teaching and your ministry to particular students. You may be surprised at some of the things you see. And so it's helpful in that you actually can have a better feel for the people that God has called you to minister to if you're on those platforms and you're able to, to see the people that God has called you to reach. There's also something to be said for, finding good resources and passing them along. So if you're, if there's a great YouTube video from like the Bible Project or the Gospel Coalition, or, something that is really compelling for a certain thing that you're wanting, be able to send that. You want to make sure that any group or any YouTube or thing that you're sending people to, you're great if they were to kind of go down the rabbit hole and like look at other videos from the people or the group, because there's a lot of information that can come through things that you're sharing. But that's one way of using, I think, this in a good way. As a parent, though, you've got to think about limits. You got to, I just, nothing good is going to happen. I'm not saying that something bad happens all the time, but nothing really good is going to happen with, students that are teenagers that are on their phones at 11:30 at night, texting, Instagramming or whatever, when everyone else is in bed with their phones right by their pillows. Like, that's just a recipe for things and for conversations and for stupidity and things is not good. And for some reason, it just seems like a lot of parents have sort of abdicated responsibility and role for what is actually happening socially with kids on the phone. So I think parents have got to think about limits. They've got to think about rules of the game, how that looks. And, there are Bible apps and things like that too, which are great. Even on that though, you want to use that. I've seen that being used, maybe doing a Bible reading plan with a few guys from a youth group or in a college ministry. You're doing that together. You can track each other's progress. That's great. I think a good way. But if all of your reading is on the Bible app, it's going to be bite-sized and nuggets more than like actual devotion of attention. And there's also a social element to Bible apps because people will like things and comment on things. And so what happens when the Bible itself becomes social media? Like, I think some of these things can be supplemental, but they can't really replace the devoted, dedicated, I want to hear from God, and I'm going to give myself over to this book kind of things that has to happen with more long form reading and understanding. So we just got to be aware and cognizant of those things as we move forward.
Okay, Trevin. So one of the things I wanted to ask that we got some questions on is, do you see theology and discipleship training as essential? Which it seems like you certainly would, but
yes. Yeah.
So, but I think the next question is the one that can be more fruitful here. What is the relationship between theology, discipleship, and apologetics in the church?
Yeah. So definitely theology and discipleship training are essential. And the relationship, though, to me, it goes down to what kind of disciples are we wanting to form? Are we wanting to conform consumers? Are we wanting to form consumers who will just come into our sanctuaries and participate in a worship environment and, give to the church and maybe read their Bible occasionally, but who see the church as basically helping them be good, expressive individualists? Like the church just helps them be the better person that they wanted to be and to find and express themselves, to be more moral, to be more upright, upstanding, Is that what we want to form, or do we want to form disciples who are deeply rooted in their faith, deeply committed to Jesus Christ, in it for the long haul, wanting to become more and more like Jesus? If we want to do that, then theology and apologetics, I think, are essential for that. Apologetics is not just a discipline for people outside the faith. It's not just pre-evangelism. Some of the ways that the Spirit of God uses apologetics is in confirming beliefs we already have as Christians. And I mean, obviously we could get into the different arguments of the different schools of apologetics and the classical and the evidentialist and the presuppositionalist and all that. But I've seen agreement from a lot of different apologists who would come from different streams that apologetics has a certain good dynamic and a good result and an effect for Christians, not just for non-Christians. So I would say that is important, and theology is important as well, because if we don't treat the Bible and Christianity as something worth our time and attention and devotion that demands something of us, then how really are we going to be communicating the value and the worth of the gospel, as well as sort of the weightiness of what we say we believe? And the follow-up question to that too is how then are we going to stand firm when the cultural winds really blow hard against us? Like if that tree doesn't have some deep roots, which are done through good theology, strong apologetics and whatnot, the trees are going to topple when the winds blow. And so we've got to think forward into what kind of Christianity we want. It may not be as broad as the Christianity we've inherited, but Lord help us if it's not deeper.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I would just say, I mean, good teaching and preaching deals with unbelief, right? I mean, what is the heart of our sin is we don't believe. We're doubting the promises of God. We're doubting, and so that's what So we need to say theology is what it is that you should believe, but apologetics is saying why you should believe it, and so seeing those things as disconnected, to me, has some big problems. And so if we're not giving the whys, if we're only giving the whats in a pluralistic post-Christian society, they want to know the whys because they're not, the what can't just be taken for granted. It's not just a given. And I would just add to this that spiritual formation is actually apologetics is tied together, because if spiritual formation is about, one way I would describe spiritual formation is being able to see the patterns, the false narratives that you're embodying and you're living in, and then stepping into the gospel story through the preaching and teaching, through the spiritual disciplines, through the sacraments. I'm an Anglican lamb now, so I'll just call them sacraments, but whatever you want to call them. And so with that, we actually put ourselves in the Christian story, and we also see how the other stories don't end well. They leave us restless. They don't deliver the goods. We see that in our own life. We teach people to see that. And then all of a sudden, when they turn to the city, when they turn to their friends, when we turn to non-believers, now we can see, actually, I know that narrative you're living because I find myself tempted to live there too. So there's a sympathy. You can relate to them, but you also can point out, this is where that's headed, and it's not going to end well, because you've already done the hard work in your own life, and your students have as well. So I actually see spiritual formation as tied to our ability to actually do this in a way that's going to be effective.
That's great. Well, we got to come to a close here and wrap this up, one of the questions, a couple of questions came up on this, and we'll just in this here. What further resources are needed to help Christians and churches equip Gen Z? Follow-up question to that: what authors should leaders be reading? So, what do you say to that as an answer, Josh?
Besides, you can get Trevin's book. You can get Trevin's book.
Our books,
So I think if you look at Tim Keller's book, Making Sense of God, Reason for God is a helpful book still. But Making Sense for God is really getting to what I've referred to as this kind of social imaginary. And how do you deal with these, and it's to use some of the categories, it's really a model, not a manual, but a model. And I think it's a really helpful one. I would recommend Alistair McGrath's work. We co-edited The History of Apologetics. Sometimes he doesn't get as much attention as I wish he would here in the States. He's at Oxford, both a scientist trained at Oxford and a theologian, and his works have been really helpful for me. The other one, if you're wanting to, you'll hear me and Trevin talk about Charles Taylor, and a lot of evangelicals have been talking about, and Christians of all stripes have been talking about him. If you want to dip your toes into Taylor, the book I would suggest is Ethics of Authenticity, which is a real short one. I mean, it's still some tough sledding, but it's not 800 pages like Secular Age or whatever it is. So that would be, if you're wanting to go kind of high end, the book I would recommend to some of you folks.
That's
good. What do you think?
Yeah, I would recommend all of those. I would certainly. I think there's. I definitely go back, and I'm not just saying this. Apologetics at the Cross is fantastic on this subject. So you and Mark did a terrific job on that. Making Sense of God, I was going to mention if you didn't, because it's actually a prequel in some ways to Reason for God, because it's actually laying out some of the work that needs to be done before you get to actual objections to the faith. Confronting Christianity by Rebecca McLaughlin is a terrific book for answering objections. I feel like it's even more timely now because we're more than a decade after the Reason for God, but it's sort of that for this moment. So that's a terrific book too. And I know we could come up with a bunch of others, and we may be in the chat interacting, offering some other suggestions. But it's my privilege to bring this event now to a close. Any of you that are watching, you can watch this again after it ends. You can use the same YouTube link. We hope that those of you who registered, some of you won the book, some of you, hopefully that those of you who registered have been able to interact with us in the chat during this time. And I want to thank you, Josh, for joining me and for us being able to talk about this very important subject together. We hope this has been helpful. Anything last you want to say to people watching?
Thanks for tuning in. I know we're suffering Zoom fatigue around here. So if you stay tuned to the very end here, man, you've been a trooper. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks so much for joining us.